At 6:42 in the morning, the sun went out. Not all at once, it did not explode or vanish. It simply grew dim, like someone had placed a gray cloth over a lamp. People on their way to work stopped walking. Birds went quiet. In cities all over the world, phones buzzed with the same message at the same second. Unknown event detected. Remain calm. Follow local guidance. In New York, a taxi driver named Sam Ruiz stepped out of his car and looked up at a sky that had turned the color of ash. In Lagos, a mother pulled her children close and watched the light fade from gold to gray to something close to twilight, even though it was still morning. In Tokyo, in London, in Cairo, in every city on Earth, billions of people looked up and felt the same cold fear settle into their chests. The sun was still there. They could see its shape, a pale circle behind a strange dark haze, but its heat was fading and its light was dying, and no one on the street knew why. Deep under the Rocky Mountains, in a command center built into solid rock, the mood was very different. General Elena Voss stood in front of a wall of screens showing feeds from around the world. She was 51 years old, with short gray hair and the kind of calm face that made people trust her even in the worst moments. She did not look afraid. She looked like someone who had been waiting a very long time for exactly this day. "Confirm it," she said. "I want 3 separate readings before I tell the president anything." A young officer at a console answered without looking up. "Confirmed, General." Solar output down 11% and falling. The drop started at the edge of the system, not at the sun itself. Something is wrapping around it. "Wrapping around it," Elena repeated quietly. She had read that phrase in classified reports for 20 years. She had hoped she would never hear it spoken out loud. Behind her, a door opened, and Dr. Marcus Chen walked in, still buttoning his lab coat. He was 60 years old, small and wiry, with the tired eyes of a man who had spent most of his life working nights. He had once been a young astrophysicist who found something strange in the sky. Now he was the closest thing humanity had to an expert on the enemy. "It's them," Marcus said. It was not a question. Elena nodded. "It's them." Marcus let out a long breath. For a moment, something like relief crossed his face, quickly replaced by grim focus. 40 years, he said. 40 years we said this day might come, and now it's here and I still don't feel ready. "Nobody feels ready for the end of the world," Elena said. "That's why we didn't build our plan around feeling ready. We built it around facts." She turned to the room. "Activate Concord Protocol, all levels now." The order moved through the command center like a wave. Officers picked up phones connected to lines that had never been used outside of drills. Screens that had shown ordinary news feeds switched to a different kind of map, one that showed structures the public did not know existed. Underground cities, hidden farms, fusion reactors built to mimic sunlight, and shipyards hidden on the far side of the moon. To understand why this room was so calm while the rest of the world panicked, you would have to go back 4 decades, to a night in Antarctica when a piece of alien technology fell out of the sky and buried itself in the ice. That story would come later. For now, what mattered was this. Humanity had known for 40 years that somewhere out among the stars there was an empire that conquered worlds not with bombs, but by killing their sons. They called themselves the Zoran, though most humans who worked in the deepest layers of government simply called them the Dimmers, a nickname born from old fear. The Zoran Empire had a weapon called the Umbral Lance, sometimes translated more simply as the Long Night. It was not a single device but a swarm, thousands of small dark constructs that spread out and wrapped themselves around a star, feeding on its light and choking its warmth before it could reach the planets below. A world with a dying sun could not grow food. It could not run on solar power. Within a year, its crops would fail. Within 2 years, its climate would collapse into permanent winter. The Zoran did not need to fire a single shot. They only needed to wait for hunger and cold to do the work for them. And then they would land their ships on a broken, desperate planet and take whatever they wanted. Marcus Chen had learned all of this from the wreck in Antarctica, from the surviving data cores of a Zoran scout ship that had crashed there after some kind of malfunction. The world's governments had faced a terrible choice that year: tell the public and risk mass panic and collapse, or keep it secret and prepare in the shadows. They chose secrecy, but not because they wanted to hide the truth forever. They chose it because 40 years was, they believed, just barely enough time to get ready, and they could not afford a single year lost to riots or despair. So the Terran Conquered was born, a secret alliance between every major government on Earth, working together for the first time in history not out of friendship, but out of shared fear. And for 40 years, while the world above went on with its normal life, arguing over small things, working ordinary jobs, falling in love and raising children, another world was built beneath it, one designed to survive exactly this morning. In the command center, Elena watched the numbers falling on the screen. 11%, now 14. The Zoran swarm was spreading fast. Time until surface agriculture fails, she asked. At this rate, Marcus said, checking his tablet, 6 months before major crop loss. A year before global famine, if nothing changes. And our systems? Marcus allowed himself a small, tired smile. Ember City's reactor has been running steady for 3 years. It doesn't care if the sun goes out. Neither do the other 11 Ember Cities. We can feed 20 million people underground indefinitely, and we can expand the surface shelters to take in far more once the evacuation begins. 20 million people out of 8 billion. It was not enough, and everyone in that room knew it. The full Conquered plan had never promised to save everyone in the first strike. It promised something else. Time. Time to move people, time to activate hidden infrastructure across the world. And most importantly, time for the second part of the plan, the part that very few people, even inside the Conquered, were fully briefed on. The hidden fleet. Get me HFY, Elena said. A moment later, a screen flickered on, showing a man in his 40s with dark skin and sharp, alert eyes, sitting in the cockpit of something that did not look like any spacecraft the public had ever seen. Behind him, through a viewport, the gray, cratered surface of the moon's far side was visible, along with the shapes of massive hangar doors built into the rock. Captain James HFY did not waste time on greetings. General, we're reading the same drop in output you are. Is this it? This is it, Elena said. Umbral Lance's signature confirmed. Prepare the fleet for activation, but do not move until my order. I don't want the Zoran to know what we have until it's too late for them to plan around it. HFY's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Understood. Conquered fleet is at full readiness. We've got 60 warships hidden in the lunar yards and another 40 scattered through the asteroid belt, all cloaked, all silent. They won't see us coming until we want them to. Good, Elena said. Because in a few hours, their fleet is going to arrive to check on their work. And when they see that Earth isn't dying the way it should be, they are going to be very confused and very angry. Marcus, standing beside her, folded his arms and looked at the dimming image of the sun on the main screen. They've done this to other worlds before us, he said quietly. Every time the pattern is the same. Dim the star, wait for the world below to collapse, then land and take whatever survivors are useful and leave the rest. They don't expect resistance because by the time they arrive to finish the job, there's usually nothing left to resist with. They've never met a species that saw it coming, Elena said. Above them, on the surface, the world was beginning to understand that something was deeply wrong. News anchors spoke in careful, worried voices about an unexplained solar event. Scientists who were not part of the Conquered scrambled to explain a mystery they had no data to solve. Ordinary people began to argue online, some claiming it was a hoax, others already predicting disaster, most simply frightened and unsure of what to believe. They did not know yet that far below their feet, in cities carved from rock, powered by sons of humanity's own making, calm men and women in uniform were already moving crates of supplies, already opening the doors of shelters built decades ago and never used, already preparing to welcome the first waves of evacuees who would arrive within days. They did not know that somewhere near the moon, 60 warships sat in silence, engines cold, weapons ready, waiting for a single word. And they did not know that far out at the edge of the solar system, Sensors built from technology stolen from a crashed enemy scout ship had just detected something enormous entering the system. A Zoran war fleet, coming to check on the death of a star they believed they had already claimed. In the command center, Elena Voss watched the new contact appear on the map, a cluster of red dots crossing the orbit of Neptune, moving inward. "There they are," she said softly. Marcus stepped closer to the screen, his old eyes narrowing at the shapes. 40 years of waiting," he murmured, "and it comes down to this." Elena turned to the room, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of every drill, every meeting, every sleepless night that had led to this moment. "All stations, this is General Voss. The enemy is inside the system. Earth is not defenseless. Repeat, Earth is not defenseless. Today they learned that the hard way." On the screen, the pale, dimming sun hung above a planet that looked, from a distance, exactly like every other world the Zoran had ever conquered. Quiet, dark, and dying. But appearances, as the Zoran were about to discover, could be deeply and dangerously wrong. 40 years earlier, on a night when the wind screamed across the Antarctic ice, a young researcher named Marcus Chen had been the first human being to touch a piece of alien metal. He had been part of a small science team studying strange readings picked up by a research station near the South Pole, readings that looked like a meteor impact but did not behave like one. When his team reached the crash site, they found a wound in the ice nearly a kilometer wide, and at the bottom of it, half buried in frozen rock, a broken shape unlike anything built by human hands. It was long and dark, its hull scorched and torn, clearly the wreck of some kind of vessel. And it was not empty. Inside, the team found the bodies of 3 creatures, tall and thin, with gray skin and large black eyes, wearing suits of a material no lab on Earth could identify. 2 were beyond any hope of study. The third, badly injured, lived for 11 days after the crash, kept alive in a hastily built quarantine chamber while doctors and scientists worked desperately to understand what they had found. It never spoke a word that anyone could translate, but before it died, it left something behind that changed the future of the human race. The ship's data core, cracked open by the crash, spilling fragments of information into instruments that had never been designed to read them. It took years to decode even a small part of what was recovered, but what they learned was enough to terrify every government on Earth. The wrecked ship belonged to a scouting division of an empire called the Zoran, a civilization that had been expanding across the stars for longer than human history had existed. The Zoran did not conquer worlds the way old human stories imagined alien invasions, with armies landing and cities burning under laser fire. They conquered efficiently, patiently, and with almost no risk to themselves. They identified a world with intelligent life, studied it from a distance for years or even decades, and when they were ready, they deployed the umbral lance, the swarm weapon that dimmed a star's light and simply waited. A world without a healthy sun could not feed itself for long. Farms failed, oceans cooled, ice spread. Panic and war followed as desperate nations fought each other over the last of the warmth and the last of the food. By the time the Zoran fleet actually arrived to claim the planet, most of the hard work of destroying it had already been done by the planet's own people, fighting each other in the dark and the cold. The scout ship that crashed in Antarctica had been part of an early survey of Earth, likely present for years, quietly watching, before some unknown malfunction sent it crashing into the ice. It was, the analysts realized with a chill, almost certainly not the only Zoran presence that had ever visited the solar system. It might simply have been the only one unlucky enough to get caught. The leaders who learned this truth faced an impossible choice: tell the world, and risk a global panic that could tear apart the very unity needed to survive. Or keep it secret, and use the time bought by that secrecy to prepare in the shadows. They chose secrecy, and so, in conference rooms and bunkers across the world, the Terran Conquered was formed, a hidden alliance between nations that had spent centuries distrusting one another, now united by a threat too large for any single country to face alone. It was, Marcus Chen would say years later, the only time in human history that fear had done more good than harm. The Conquered's plan had 3 parts: built to work together over 4 decades. The first part was survival infrastructure. Deep beneath the surface, in old mines, in newly dug caverns, in mountains chosen for their stability, engineers built what came to be called ember cities. Self-contained underground settlements powered by small fusion reactors designed to produce light and heat close enough to real sunlight to keep crops growing and people healthy. By the time the sun dimmed, 12 ember cities existed, scattered across every continent, each one capable of housing and feeding more than 1 million people, with room to expand rapidly once the crisis began. They had been built slowly, disguised as ordinary infrastructure and mining projects, funded through budgets no journalist ever thought to question. The second part was technology. Using fragments recovered from the crashed scout ship, and later from other, smaller pieces of debris found across the decades, human scientists slowly reverse-engineered pieces of Zoran technology. Progress was painfully slow at first. It took 15 years just to understand the basic principles behind the alien stealth field, the technology that let their ships hide from sensors. It took another 10 to build a version humanity could reproduce reliably. But by the time the sun went dark, human warships could vanish from enemy scanners almost as well as the Zoran's own vessels, and human hulls were plated with alloys strong enough to survive weapons that would have vaporized anything built with older methods. The third part was the fleet, and it was the part kept most secret of all. On the far side of the moon, hidden from Earth's view and from casual observation by any watching eyes, the Conquered built shipyards. Over 4 decades, working in secret with a workforce recruited from every corner of the globe and sworn to lifelong silence, those shipyards produced the Conquered fleet. 100 warships, cloaked, hardened against the kind of weapons expected from the Zoran, and armed with technology built from stolen alien knowledge combined with humanity's own stubborn ingenuity. Captain James Ockafer had been a young engineer when he first walked through the empty hull of the very first Conquered warship, a vessel later named the Prometheus. He remembered standing in that cold, half-built corridor and thinking that he was looking at either humanity's salvation or its greatest and most expensive act of paranoia. 20 years later, sitting in the command chair of that same ship, watching sensor readings confirm a Zoran fleet entering the solar system, he understood which one it had turned out to be. Far out past the orbit of Neptune, the Zoran war fleet moved inward at a steady, unhurried pace. There was no reason for them to rush. In 4 decades of expansion, no world had ever resisted them after the Umbral Lance had done its work. They had grown used to arriving at dying planets and finding broken, desperate populations too weak and divided to offer any real threat. Leading this particular fleet was High Marshal Threx, a veteran commander with over 2 centuries of conquest behind him, though by Zoran measures of age that made him only middle-aged. Threx sat on the bridge of his flagship, a vessel twice the size of anything in the Conquered fleet, and studied the readings coming from the dimming star ahead of him with mild, practiced satisfaction. "Report," he said, his voice translated by his own species' technology into a flat, mechanical tone that carried no real emotion, though those who served under him long enough learned to read the subtle signs of his mood in his posture and the flick of his eyes. An officer at a nearby station answered, "Umbral swarm deployment at 73% completion, High Marshal. Solar output already reduced by 19%. Projected full effect within standard local months." And the target world? Reading standard technological signatures, High Marshal. Radio broadcasts, energy grids, orbital satellites. Consistent with a pre-conquest civilization. No unusual military activity detected. Threx allowed himself something close to satisfaction. This was, by his estimation, the 412th world his people had brought under the long night's shadow. The process was, by now, close to routine. He had no reason to believe this world would be any different from the others. He did not know, and could not have known, that hidden sensors built from the wreckage of his own empire's technology were tracking his fleet's every move. He did not know that beneath the surface of the world he had come to conquer, cities powered by artificial suns were already welcoming the first waves of evacuated citizens. Calm and organized, following plans, rehearsed 100 times in drills over 40 years. He did not know that on the far side of the planet's lone moon, 100 warships sat cloaked and silent, waiting. "Continue the approach," Threx ordered. "Standard procedure. We will observe the collapse from orbit before deploying ground forces, as always." As his fleet moved deeper into the system, past the orbit of Mars, closer to the pale, dimming star and the small blue world beneath it, Threx allowed his attention to drift, already thinking ahead to the reports he would file once this world, like all the others, had been broken and claimed. He did not notice the small, faint anomaly that flickered briefly on a secondary sensor array, a shape near the edge of a distant asteroid field that did not match the background noise of space, and then vanished again before any officer thought it worth reporting. It was, in fact, a conquered scout ship, cloaked and silent, watching the Zoran fleet's every move and relaying it back to the command center buried beneath the Rocky Mountains, where Alina Voss and Marcus Chen stood before a wall of screens, counting down the hours until the moment humanity had prepared for a cross for long decades finally arrived. "They have no idea," Marcus said quietly, watching the enemy fleet's steady, confident approach. "No," Alina agreed. "They don't, and that is exactly how we want it for just a little while longer." 3 days after the sun began to dim, the Zoran fleet settled into orbit around Earth. From the bridge of his flagship, High Marshal Threx looked down at the planet through a massive viewport. It was a beautiful world, he had to admit, blue and green, wrapped in white clouds, even now beginning to shiver under a sky slowly losing its warmth. He had seen this sight hundreds of times before, on hundreds of other worlds, and it never failed to give him a quiet, cold satisfaction. Soon this planet, like all the others, would belong to the Zoran Empire. "Report on surface conditions," he said. An officer studied a screen filled with data pulled from the planet's own communication networks, which the Zoran had been quietly monitoring for years. "Average surface temperature dropping across the northern hemisphere, High Marshal. Public communications show rising confusion and fear. Several governments have declared states of emergency. No sign of coordinated resistance." "As expected," Threx said. What he did not say, because he did not yet know it, was that the panic on the surface was carefully managed. Government broadcasts spoke of an unexplained solar anomaly and urged calm, while behind the scenes, in 12 hidden cities beneath the Earth's crust, evacuation efforts were already moving millions of people to safety with a speed and order that would have taken any ordinary, unprepared nation years to organize. The public panic was real, but the collapse the Zoran expected to follow it was not coming, not the way it always had before. For 3 more days, Threx's fleet observed and waited, following the same slow, patient pattern that had worked on over 400 other worlds. And for 3 days, deep beneath the surface, the Terran Conquered finished the final stages of its plan. In the command center under the Rocky Mountains, Alina Voss watched a live feed of the Zoran fleet's positions, relayed from the same hidden sensors that had tracked their approach through the system. Beside her, Marcus Chen studied a separate screen showing something far more encouraging. Reports from all 12 Ember cities confirming successful reception of the first 400 million evacuees, with systems still expanding to take in more. "Fleet positions are stable," said a young officer at the main console. "They're holding orbit, mostly over the Western Hemisphere. No sign they've detected our forces on the moon." "Good," Alina said. She turned to a secure comm channel. "Captain Acaffer's status." On the screen, James Acaffer sat in the command chair of the Prometheus, the ship's bridge lit by the soft blue glow of alien-derived instruments. Around him, through the viewport, the dark shapes of 99 other cloaked warships waited in silence in the shadow of the moon's far side. "Conquered fleet is ready, General," Acaffer said. "Cloaks holding steady, weapons charged. We've run the simulations 1,000 times. My people are ready to fly them for real." "This won't be a simulation," Alina said quietly. "We've never fought a fleet this size before. Their flagship alone is twice the mass of anything we've built." "We know," HFY said, and there was no fear in his voice, only a hard, steady resolve. "But we've got something they don't expect. They think this is world number 412. They don't know they picked the one world that saw them coming." Elena allowed herself a small, tight smile. "Then let's show them their mistake. On my mark, begin the approach. Slow and quiet, exactly as planned. We want to be in strike range before they know we exist." "Understood, General." Conquered fleet moving to attack position. Across the dark, silent shipyards on the far side of the moon, 100 warships began to move. They did not roar to life the way old human science fiction imagined starships launching into battle. They simply drifted forward, engines running just above idle, hulls wrapped in cloaking fields that bent light and scattered sensors, gliding out from the shadow of the moon toward the far side of the Earth, invisible to every Zoran instrument watching the planet below. It took nearly 6 hours for the fleet to reach striking distance, moving slowly enough to avoid any chance of detection. 6 hours in which every crew member aboard those 100 ships sat in tense, disciplined silence, checking and rechecking systems that had been checked 1,000 times already, because there was nothing else to do but wait and trust the plan that 4 decades of secret work had built. At last, the Prometheus and its 99 sister ships reached position, spread in a wide formation around the far side of the Zoran fleet, hidden behind the curve of the Earth itself, close enough to strike, still completely unseen. "All ships in position," HFY reported, "awaiting your order, General." In the command center, Elena Voss looked at the map one last time. Red dots representing the Zoran fleet hung in a loose cluster above the planet. Blue dots representing the conquered fleet surrounded them from the far side, unseen and unheard. 40 years of preparation had led to this single moment. "Fire when ready, Captain," she said. "For Earth." "For Earth," HFY repeated and gave the order. The first strike came without warning. 100 warships dropped their cloaking fields at the same instant and opened fire. Their weapons, built from decades of study of stolen Zoran technology, combined with humanity's own relentless engineering, tearing into the unprepared enemy fleet from a direction no Zoran sensor had been watching. On the bridge of his flagship, High Marshal Threx felt the ship lurch violently as an explosion tore through one of the outer decks. Alarms blared across the bridge. Officers who had spent their careers watching helpless, dying worlds now scrambled in genuine shock, trying to understand an attack that should have been impossible. "Report," Threx demanded, gripping the arm of his command chair as another impact shook the ship. "What is firing on us?" "Unknown contacts, High Marshal. They came from behind the planet, out of nowhere. Shields down on the Vareth and the Koravan, both taking heavy damage. We are under attack from a full fleet." Threx stared at the tactical display in disbelief. 100 enemy vessels had appeared as if from nothing, already inside his formation, already firing with terrifying accuracy. This was not the behavior of a dying, primitive world. This was the behavior of an enemy that had been waiting for him. "Impossible," he said almost to himself. "This world showed no signs of—" Another explosion cut him off as a conquered warship's weapons found their mark on one of his escort cruisers, tearing it open along its flank. Around him, his officers scrambled to bring weapons and shields online, to organize a defense against an attack their training, and 400 previous conquests had never prepared them for. Aboard the Prometheus, James HFY watched the battle unfold on his tactical display with fierce, focused concentration. "Keep the pressure on their flagship," he ordered. "Don't let them regroup. Squadron 2, target their escort screen, break their formation apart." Around the curve of the Earth, the battle raged, human ships weaving through Zoran fire with speed and precision built from decades of simulation and training, striking hard and fast before pulling back into partial cloak, denying the larger, heavier Zoran warships a clean target. It was not an easy fight. The Zoran fleet was larger, and its individual ships were tougher, built by an empire with centuries more experience in interstellar warfare than humanity possessed. 2 conquered warships were lost within the first 20 minutes, their crews given no time to escape. But for every human loss, the Zoran paid a far higher price, caught completely off guard, their formation broken, their commanders scrambling to understand an enemy that fought with a discipline and coordination they had never encountered on a first-contact world. In the command center on Earth, Elena Voss watched the battle map with a face carved from stone, giving no sign of the fear tightening in her chest as she watched blue dots blink out one by one, even as far more red dots vanished alongside them. "We're taking losses, General," the young officer at the console reported, his voice tight. "I know," Elena said quietly, "but look at their formation, they're breaking. They've never faced a fight like this before and it shows." On the bridge of his flagship, High Marshal Threx watched 2 more of his cruisers go dark on his tactical display, and for the first time in over 2 centuries of service to the Zoran Empire, he felt something he had almost forgotten the shape of: doubt. "Pull the fleet back to defensive formation around the flagship," he ordered, his translated voice betraying, for just a moment, a note of something close to alarm. "Full power to the Umbral Lance control array. If this world thinks it can fight us, then let it choke in the dark while we burn it from orbit." Far below, the pale, dying sun hung in a sky already darker than it should have been, while above the planet's surface, 2 fleets tore into each other in a battle that neither side, for very different reasons, had expected to fight this way. High Marshal Threx's order to strengthen the Umbral Lance sent a wave of urgency through the conquered command center. "General, we're reading a massive power spike from the enemy control array," the young officer called out, watching numbers climb rapidly on his screen. "If they push the swarm to full strength, projected solar output could drop by another 40% within hours, not months." Elena Voss felt her stomach tighten. A drop that steep that fast would do more than threaten crops. It could destabilize weather patterns across the entire planet within days, causing storms and freezes that even the Ember City's careful preparations had not fully accounted for. "Marcus," she said, turning to Chen, "talk to me. Is there any way to stop that array from orbit?" Marcus had already pulled up old data, fragments recovered over decades from pieces of Zoran technology, including notes taken from the very first crashed scout ship in Antarctica. "The control array has to be on their flagship," he said, thinking fast. "Every Zoran system we've ever studied uses a centralized command structure. It's a weakness of their design, honestly. They never expected anyone capable of reaching that ship." "Can we destroy it?" "Maybe," Marcus said. "But if you destroy the array while it's mid-activation, there's a real risk it locks the swarm at whatever strength it's reached. We might stop it from getting worse, but we might not be able to undo the damage already done. There's a better option, if we're fast enough and lucky enough." "Which is?" "Capture it," Marcus said. "Not destroy it. Take the array intact, shut it down properly instead of blowing it apart. If we can get a team aboard that flagship, I can walk them through a shutdown sequence based on what we learned from the wreck. It's a gamble, but it's the only option that gives us a chance to actually reverse this, not just freeze it in place." Elena looked at him for a long moment, then turned back to the comm channel. "Akafer. Did you hear that?" On the bridge of the Prometheus, James Akafer had indeed heard every word, his jaw tight with the weight of what was being asked. "I heard, General, you want a boarding team on the enemy flagship in the middle of a battle to shut down their weapon by hand." "That's exactly what I want," Elena said. "I know what I'm asking." Akafer was already moving, calling up a tactical display and marking a small strike team. "I've got a squad for this. Sergeant Priya Nair, best boarding specialist we've got, trained for exactly this kind of mission since she was 22. She'll want to lead it herself." "Then send her," Elena said. "And James, tell her time is not on our side." Within minutes, a small, fast-conquered shuttle broke away from the main battle, weaving between explosions and weapon fire, its hull protected by a short-range cloaking field just strong enough to slip past the Zoran flagship's outer defenses in the chaos of combat. Inside, Sergeant Priya Nair checked her weapon and looked back at the 5 soldiers behind her, their faces set with the same grim determination she felt in her own chest. "Remember the mission," she said over the comm, her voice steady despite the shuddering of the shuttle as it dodged incoming fire. "We are not here to fight their whole crew. We get to that control array, we shut it down, and we get out. Chen's instructions, step by step, nothing improvised unless we have no choice." The shuttle slammed into a docking clamp near a damaged section of the Zoran flagship's hull, breaching through a weakened bulkhead torn open earlier by conquered fleet weapons fire. Nair and her team moved fast through smoke-filled corridors lit by flickering alien lighting, following a path mapped out from decades-old data recovered from a ship that had crashed on Earth long before any of them were born. They met resistance almost immediately. Zoran crew members, tall and gray-skinned, moved through the corridors with weapons that fired bursts of white-hot energy, and the fighting was brutal and close. But Nair's team had trained for exactly this kind of fight for years, moving with a coordination and discipline. The confused, scrambling Zoran defenders struggled to match in the chaos of a battle they had never expected to face. Aboard his bridge, High Marshal Threx received the reports of the boarding action with cold fury. "Intruders aboard the ship. Impossible. Seal every corridor between them and the command deck. I will not have primitives crawling through my flagship like insects." But the corridors could not be sealed fast enough. Nair's team pushed deeper into the ship, guided by Marcus Chen's voice over a secure channel, relayed all the way from the command center under the Rocky Mountains, walking them through the layout of a ship none of them had ever set foot on before. "You're close," Marcus said, watching data feed in from Nair's suit sensors. "The control array should be through the next junction, in a chamber near the ship's core. Based on the old data, it will be guarded, and it will be heavily shielded." "Understood," Nair said, breathing hard as she led her team around a corner, weapon raised. Ahead of them, through a wide archway, stood the chamber Marcus had described. A vast, dimly lit space dominated by a massive, pulsing construct of dark metal and glowing energy conduits, the physical heart of the Umbral Lance's control system, guarded by a dozen armed Zoran soldiers. "That's it," Nair breathed. "That's the array." The fight that followed was fierce and fast. Nair's team used the chamber's tight corridors and support pillars for cover, trading fire with the Zoran guards in short, brutal bursts. 2 of her soldiers went down, wounded but alive, dragged behind cover by their teammates. But slowly, methodically, the conquered team pushed forward, until at last Nair reached the base of the massive control array itself, breathing hard, her weapon smoking, her team holding the chamber's entrance against the last of the guards. "Chen, I'm at the array," she said. "Talk me through it fast." Marcus's voice came back immediately, steady despite the tension in the command center around him. "Look for a panel on the lower left of the main housing, marked with a triangular symbol. Old data suggests it's the primary access point." Nair found it, tore the panel open with her hands, and stared at a mess of alien components she had never seen before in her life. "I'm looking at it. It looks nothing like the diagrams." "It won't be identical," Marcus said. "The scout ship we studied was decades old and much smaller than this. Look for 3 parallel conduits running horizontal, glowing pale blue. If you see them, that's your primary power feed." "I see them." "Good. There should be a manual override switch just beneath them, recessed into the housing." Nair's fingers found it, a small, unfamiliar mechanism half hidden in the tangle of alien technology. "Found it." "Nair," Marcus said, his voice suddenly urgent. "Once you trigger that switch, the array will begin an emergency shutdown sequence, but it will take almost 90 seconds to complete. You need to hold that chamber until it's done, or the whole effort is wasted." On the bridge above, High Marshal Threx received a report that made his blood run cold in a way it had not in over 2 centuries of service. "High Marshal, intruders have reached the primary control array. They are attempting to interface with the shutdown mechanism." "No," Threx said, rising from his command chair. "Divert every available soldier to that chamber." I will not lose this world because of primitives with stolen knowledge. Back in the chamber, Nair triggered the switch and the great construct before her shuddered, its glowing conduits flickering and dimming as an alien shutdown sequence, foreign and half understood, began to run. "It started," she called out. 90 seconds, hold the line." Zoran reinforcements poured into the chamber almost immediately, and the fighting became desperate, close quarters chaos. Nair and her remaining soldiers fighting to hold a narrow chokepoint against a rising tide of enemy troops, buying seconds with every shot fired, every soldier who refused to fall back. In the command center, Elena Voss watched the countdown Marcus had displayed on the main screen, ticking down second by agonizing second, while reports of the desperate fight aboard the flagship streamed in, growing more dire with every passing moment. "Come on," Elena whispered, watching the timer. "Come on, hold it." Aboard the Prometheus, James Ockafer made a decision of his own. "All ships, converge fire on the flagship's forward defense grid. Give that boarding team room to breathe. We are not losing them now." The conquered fleet surged forward as one, concentrating everything they had on the Zoran flagship's defenses, drawing enemy fire and attention away from the desperate fight happening deep inside the ship's hull. In the chamber, Nair fired the last charge from her weapon and grabbed a fallen soldier's rifle, blood running from a wound along her arm. Her team down to 3 able bodies, the chamber's entrance nearly overrun. The countdown reached 0. The great array shuddered one final time, its glowing conduits going completely dark, and across the solar system, in a sky above every city on Earth, the sun flickered and began, ever so slightly, to grow brighter. The moment the umbral lance array went dark, something changed across the entire battlefield. Aboard the Zoran flagship, alarms shifted in tone as backup systems struggled to compensate for the sudden loss of the weapon that had defined every conquest the Empire had achieved for centuries. On the bridge, High Marshal Threx stared at his tactical display in stunned silence as reports flooded in from every station, each one worse than the last. "Umbral Lance offline, High Marshal. Swarm dispersal beginning. We cannot reactivate the array without a full rebuild which cannot be completed in the field." Threx said nothing for a long moment. In over 2 centuries of service, he had never lost a weapon like this, never faced a world that fought back with such coordination, such preparation. Every instinct trained into him by the Empire told him this was impossible, and yet the proof sat right in front of him on his own tactical screens. Deep inside the flagship, Sergeant Priya Nair leaned against the now silent control array, breathing hard, blood soaking through the sleeve of her uniform, her remaining soldiers standing guard around her with weapons raised at the retreating Zoran forces, who had pulled back in confusion once their commanders realized the array's shutdown could not be reversed by force. "Chen," she said into her comm, her voice rough with exhaustion. "It's done. Array is dark." In the command center under the Rocky Mountains, a cheer went up that Elena Voss allowed to run its course for exactly 5 seconds before raising her hand for silence. There was still a battle to win, and a fleet still filling the sky above Earth. "Ockafer," she said, "the lances down, push the advantage. Force their surrender if you can. We've proven our point. There's no need for this to become a slaughter on either side." Aboard the Prometheus, James Ockafer watched his tactical display, where the Zoran fleet, already battered and now leaderless in its central purpose, was beginning to fracture into disorganized retreat. "All ships, focus fire on the flagship's remaining shield generators. Let's convince the High Marshal that today is not a good day to keep fighting." The conquered fleet surged forward with renewed intensity, and within minutes, the Zoran flagship's shields collapsed entirely, leaving it exposed and vulnerable, surrounded by human warships that could, if they chose, finish the job completely. On the bridge, Threx looked at the wreckage of his fleet on the display before him, at the silent, dead weapon that had defined his entire military career, and understood with the particular bitterness of a man forced to recognize an unfamiliar truth, that this world was not going to fall the way the other 411 had fallen before it. "Open a channel," he said quietly, "to their command authority, whoever leads them." Minutes later, in the command center under the Rocky Mountains, a translated voice, flat and mechanical, filled the room for the first time in human history. The voice of a Zoran High Marshal, speaking directly to the leaders of Earth. "This is High Marshal Threx of the Zoran Empire. I request terms." Elena Voss stepped forward, her heart pounding, aware that every word she spoke now would be remembered for the rest of human history. "This is General Elena Voss, speaking for the Terran Conquered, representing the people of Earth. Your fleet has lost its primary weapon. Your forces are surrounded. Withdraw from our system, and we will allow your surviving ship safe passage beyond our borders." There was a long pause before Threx answered. "You knew we were coming." "We did," Elena said. "For 40 years, we prepared for this exact day. You are not the first enemy to underestimate a world because its sky looked calm from orbit." Another pause, longer this time. "No world has ever resisted the long night before." "Then it seems," Elena said, "that you have found the first." In the end, Threx withdrew his fleet, battered and humiliated, retreating beyond the edge of the solar system under the watchful eyes of the conquered fleet, which escorted them out with cold, disciplined precision, making certain the Zoran understood exactly how thoroughly their plan had failed. Above Earth, the swarm of dark constructs that had wrapped around the sun for days began to disperse, drifting apart and fading from the sky, their control lost with the destruction of the array that had commanded them. Slowly, over the following weeks, the sun returned to its full strength, its light and warmth spreading back across a planet that had come startlingly close to a fate suffered by 411 worlds before it. The story could not stay hidden after that. Too many people had seen too much, from the dimming sky above to the sudden, unexplained appearance of massive warships in low orbit. The Terran Conquered, after 40 years of careful secrecy, finally revealed the truth to the world. The crash in Antarctica, the decades of quiet preparation, the underground cities and hidden fleets that had been built while the rest of the world lived its ordinary life above. There was anger, of course. There always is, when people learn a truth this large has been kept from them for so long. There were investigations, arguments, and grief for those who had died in a battle most of the planet had not even known was happening above their heads. But there was also slowly something else. A strange and powerful sense of pride, the understanding that their species, faced with an impossible threat, had chosen not to panic and wait for death, but to plan, to build, and to fight back. Marcus Chen stood at a podium months later, in front of cameras broadcasting to every corner of the globe, and told the world the story of a young researcher on an Antarctic ice sheet, 40 years earlier, who had touched a piece of metal that did not belong on Earth and understood, in that moment, that humanity's future had changed forever. "We are not the strongest species in this galaxy," he said, looking out at a world finally allowed to know its own history. "We are not the oldest or the most advanced, but we have always been good at one thing above all others, preparing for tomorrow even when tomorrow seems impossible to imagine. That is what saved us, not luck, not power. Preparation and the willingness to work together, in secret and in the open, for the sake of a future none of us were certain we would live to see." James Ockhaffer, standing on the deck of the Prometheus months later, looked out through the viewport at a sun burning bright and full once more, and thought of the 94 conquered ships that had not survived the battle, and the crews who had given everything to buy a future for a world that had never known their names. He made a quiet promise, standing there, that their sacrifice would never be forgotten, not as long as humanity remained among the stars. Sergeant Priya Nair recovered from her wounds in an Ember City hospital, and when reporters finally learned her name and asked her what it had felt like to stand in an alien chamber, holding a line against overwhelming odds, she gave a simple answer that would be repeated for generations afterward. "I wasn't holding a line for myself," she said. "I was holding it for everyone who didn't know we were even fighting. That's what made it easy to keep standing." High Marshal Threx returned to Zoran space in disgrace, his failure recorded in the Empire's histories as the first true defeat the long night strategy had ever suffered. Word of Earth's resistance spread slowly through Zoran territory, and further still, through the wider community of species that lived in fear of the Empire's expansion, whispered as a story of hope by those who had begun to believe no one could ever stand against the Dimmers. On Earth, the Terran conquered did not disband after the battle. Instead, it became the foundation for something new. Humanity's first true global government, built not on conquest or ideology, but on the hard lesson that survival sometimes required setting aside old divisions for a greater, shared purpose. The Ember cities remained, no longer hidden, now open as thriving centers of a new kind of civilization that no longer feared the dark, because it had built its own light and proven it could defend it. Above the planet, the shipyards on the far side of the moon continued their work, no longer building a secret fleet, but an open one, a declaration to the wider galaxy that Earth intended to take its place among the stars, not as a victim waiting to be conquered, but as a civilization that had already shown it could not be broken by force. And sometimes, on clear nights, people who had lived through those frightening days when the sun first dimmed would look up at a sky full of stars, and think about how close their world had come to becoming the 412th conquest of an empire that had never expected resistance. They would think about the researchers on the ice, the engineers in hidden shipyards, the soldiers who fought in the dark corridors of an alien ship, and the quiet decades of preparation that had made all the difference. The sun rose the next morning, and every morning after, bright and warm and entirely humanity's own, a reminder that the greatest victories are sometimes won not in the heat of battle, but in the long, patient years of preparation that come before it.